your warm welcome. This is the most gorgeous place, and I know it's been a little cold, and I'm trying to be sympathetic. I'm from Oklahoma. So let's get right to it. I pastor a church that believes Jesus did not come to save our souls, but rather to restore them. We believe the man from Nazareth came to teach us about God, and we have ended up arguing over the things the church has taught us about Jesus. And perhaps the best way to restore the church is not for us to reinvent it, but rather for us to remember what was distinctive and radical about the first Jesus people, the ones who practiced radical hospitality, nonviolence, and a communitarian ethic that threatened the Roman Empire. But to do this, I think we need a new first premise in the church. Now, a first premise is part of what in my critical thinking class at the university we call categorical logic or syllogistic logic. It sounds complicated, but we're all familiar with this kind of reasoning. It sounds like this. Major premise, all men are mortal. That's the first premise. Socrates is a man. Minor premise, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Sometimes people will just drop the first premise out, the major premise, all men are mortal, because everyone knows that's true. So an unstated first premise in any argument, any assumed first premise in Greek logic, is called an enthymeme. E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. Makes a great password for your computers. No one's ever heard of it. Here's a more modern example. Rogaine grows hair, therefore bald men love Rogaine. See, no one thinks to state the major premise. Bald men would prefer to have hair because we assume it, so it's an enthymeme. I've become fascinated with all the assumed major premises in the church, doctrines that have been taught, and we simply assume that they are true, but may not be, and I think the granddaddy of them all is original sin. When you think about it, most of us argue over our conclusions, whether it is in religion or in politics, but not many of us back up to discuss the assumptions that underlie those arguments. Assumptions about the very nature of reality that make certain conclusions inevitable. To put this in the form of the sublime and the ridiculous, all bald men may not wish to have hair. They may like being bald. And humans may not be born bad or born into sin, as the church puts it. That first premise determines the outcome of all Orthodox Christian arguments. But what if it's not true? One of the chapters in my book, Saving Jesus from the Church, is called Original Blessing, Not Original Sin. That is not, of course, original to me. Matthew Fox came up with this in the 80s, but it was not original to Matthew Fox. He got it from the mystics of the Middle Ages. I've come to believe that, like so many other so-called essential doctrines in the church, original sin is a creation of the institution. And that, like so many other supposedly essential doctrines, it is nowhere to be found in the Bible or in the teachings of Jesus. Someone asked the great preacher Fred Craddock once what he thought of the Trinity, for example. And Fred said, "I don't think about it much. I'm more of a Bible person myself." Well, if you are a Bible person yourself, you'll have a hard time finding a lot of the doctrines we say are at the heart of the Christian faith. Take original sin, the idea that we are born into sin, that we inherit it from our first parents, Adam and Eve, that we arrive in the world as little sinners, trapped in the transgressions of those who came before us, because it's a birthright, like red hair or left-handedness. It says that we sin because we're sinners, rather than we are sinners because we sin. And there's a big difference. I mean, that's no small distinction. Original sin renders us helpless. Original blessing says we have a choice. And you got to hand it to the church. They provided all of humanity with a diagnosis for a disease for which they had the only cure. That would be the ultimate spiritual franchise. See, if you could keep the masses from challenging your assumed premises, your enthymemes, you have enormous power, like the idea of the divine right of kings. It enslaved humanity for centuries until somebody got up one day and said, king is not divine. The emperor has no clothes. The earth is not the center of the universe. The doctrine of original sin, as we understand it in the church, is nowhere to be found in Hebrew scriptures or in the New Testament either. Of course, we have this wonderful story in Genesis in which this mythical couple, Adam and Eve, have everything they need but not everything they want, and they choose to sin and then get us all kicked out of the garden. I call it a myth not because it's not true, but because it contains a truth larger than mere facts can convey. The instructions to Adam and Eve are clear enough, as you know. Do as you please, God says. Just don't do one thing. Don't eat the fruit of one tree in the middle of the garden or you will die. Nonsense, says the serpent. Go for it. It will open your eyes and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. Besides, if one is told exactly what not to do, isn't that what one then sort of wants to do? So the woman partakes, of course, because the story is written by a man. She partakes of the forbidden fruit and then she recommends it to Adam, a little temptress. And immediately they realize that they are naked, i.e. they discover shame. But the best part of the story is the passing of the buck. When confronted with this transgression, Adam blames the woman who blames the snake. It's the first example of the victimhood mentality, where no one is really ever to blame for anything. Someone else is to blame. The epicenter of this disease, by the way, is located in Washington, D.C. In the book, I explain a concept called etiology, another kind of fancy word, which I also teach my students at the university as a key to understanding much of the Bible. Etiology is usually used in medicine as a study of origins, the origins of diseases, but it has a literary manifestation, and it's an explanation of how things came to be the way they are now. So it's also an explanation of origins. And that's exactly what the story of Adam and Eve does. Looking around, the authors of that story saw a desperately imperfect and broken world and wondered, how did it get this way? I mean, if God is really all-powerful and all-loving, how do we end up being such flawed and sometimes tragic creatures? Well, you can't blame an imperfect world on a perfect God, or it would appear otherwise that God's work is defective. But this much is certain. We all do things we are told expressly not to do, right? And some realities seem particularly unfair, like women should have to give birth in great pain and also sometimes die in childbirth. And men have to work by the sweat of their brow in dusty fields until they die. We can relate to this in Oklahoma. And so the story serves to explain why, to use a Buddhist phrase, what is. Once we were perfect, frolicking blissfully in paradise, God's work was perfect, but because we chose to sin, now we suffer the consequences. We've all been kicked out of the garden, or we all live east of Eden, to put it in Steinbeck's terms. But the story does not say that we sin because we can't help ourselves. That's very important. It says we choose to sin often, and we suffer the consequences. And it was not until centuries later that the church created the doctrine of original sin. It was primarily Augustine's doing, who never did, by the way, reconcile body and soul. And he essentially took away free will when it comes to sinning. We are helpless and hopeless until we get Jesus, which, as you very well know, does not eliminate all sinning. Well, we do still sin, but then we're forgiven. Or as the bumper sticker puts it, I'm not perfect, just forgiven. Now, they call it original sin, which, by the way, led one stand-up comic to say, I'm all for original sin. I think if we're going to sin, we ought to be original about it. But in fact, the doctrine of the church really makes very unoriginal sinners out of all of us. We're just doing the same old stupid, nasty stuff all the time because we can't help ourselves. That's not very original. I saw a sign in front of a church in Oklahoma once that announced the sermon title, you know, those wayside pulpits out on the lawn, and it said in big block letters, If you're done with sin, then come on in. I thought that's clever, and I got up closer and I saw that someone had written another message just underneath it in small letters, looked like lipstick. And it said, "But if you're not quite through, call 272. The cultural dialogue around religion. But what if Matthew Fox is right? What if we are born not into original sin, but all of us as an original blessing? And it's up to us to remember where we came from, where we're going, and to whom we belong. Here's what I believe. Over the centuries, the church has unwittingly been part of this grand ecclesiastical put-down of the human race. We have focused so much of our attention on teaching people to be humble that we have forgotten how to embrace the idea that we're born in the image of God. That's our true birthright, captured by the beautiful Latin phrase, imago Dei. That is our original first premise. I'll never forget the day years ago when I reported as a 7th grader to what we used to call homeroom. You remember homeroom? Junior high school, you'd go there, get your schedule, and they'd read the roll, then you'd go off to your classes. And so I was in homeroom the first day, and the teacher was reading the names off the roll aloud, which I now understand to be a critical moment when a teacher reads the names of students aloud for the first time. That's a very tender moment, very important. Identities are being established. And so you have to be careful what you say. On that particular morning, the teacher read the name of a particular girl, and she stopped and peered over her glasses and said, is so-and-so your father? Yes, the girl replied. And is so-and-so your brother? Yes, ma'am, she said. Both the father and the brother had served prison terms on drug charges. And then the teacher said, in front of the class, well, I hope you're sure not like them. Now, how do you think that girl felt? I personally believe the teacher should have been arrested, charged with a rhetorical crime against humanity, led off in handcuffs. When we project an expectation of failure, that's usually what we get. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Have you heard this? It's cute. The only problem with I can see with it, it's false. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can totally destroy me. I wish you'd never been born. Parents have said that to children. Now, how do you recover from that? Why do we put one another down so often? Is it because we think we'll get too high an opinion of ourselves and thus become arrogant? Most arrogant people I know are that way because they don't have a very high opinion of themselves. They're insecure and are compensating. Or as my friend the rabbi put it, a man who does not love himself wisely and well will make a casualty out of the neighbor sooner or later. I love those rabbinical sayings. In fact, we so distrust our own goodness, our real birthright, which is imago Dei, that the word human has now been joined with a certain given weakness or fallibility. For example, a baseball player strikes out, not because the pitcher threw the perfect curveball, but because the batter is only human. Your grandmother who bakes cakes, you know, the 3-layer jobs that come out of the oven like a work of art and taste like sunshine in your mouth, because nobody bakes a cake like your grandmother. But one day, I don't know, something goes wrong. It falls, as they say, in the oven, flat as the sole of your shoe. And she takes it out and she apologizes, and what does she say? Well, I'm only human. Well, here's what I want to know. What was she when she baked the perfect cake? What was the baseball player when he hit the grand slam or made the diving catch? We seem to want to talk about our humanness as a way of explaining failure, but not as a way of explaining success. It's original sin over original blessing again. Listen to this. To err is human, to forgive divine. See how the pie is sliced? Humans also forgive, do they not? I can tell you from personal experience that most children, having raised 3, do not start out afflicted with excessive and crippling humility. They have to have that kind of driven into them. They don't come into the world all stooped over from loathing, calling themselves little original sinners. Take, for example, a 9-year-old boy who gets an A in arithmetic from a teacher who never gives A's. And he's on his way home from school. He is not a picture of humility. He says, look at that right there. That's an A, old Miss What's-Her-Name. Never gives an A. You see, that's an A. Not a B, not a C. That's an A, baby. I'm skipping junior high, skipping high school, and I go right on to college. Look at that. And you take that same man 30 years from now. He's grown up, he's a civic leader, he's community-minded, he's been ahead of some important project. They call him up to receive recognition. And what does he do? Stares at the floor, counts his shoelaces, mumbles a few words of thanks for all the forgotten people who made it possible. His grandmother who came over on a covered wagon. Sometimes I wish people would just get up and say, thank you, I deserve this. In fact, this ought to be made of solid gold, the way I work on this project. A man named Edgar Lee Masters from Spoon River, Illinois, wrote a bunch of poems once and called them the Spoon River Anthology. And basically, they are all framed on a simple idea. All the people in Spoon River are dead. And so now that they're dead, they're telling the truth. One of them is named Constance Hadley. And this is what she said, quote, "You praised my self-sacrifice, Spoon River, for rearing Irene and Mary, orphans of my older sister. And you censured Irene and Mary's contempt of me. Don't praise my self-sacrifice and don't censure their contempt of me. I cared for them, it's true enough, but I poisoned all my benefactions to them by constant reminders of their dependence on me." You know what she means. It sounds like this: as long as you girls set foot under my table, as long as you sleep under this roof, remember who took you in when your mother died? Is it any wonder that when we try to help people sometimes, they so often end up hating us for it? When I was a boy growing up in Wichita, Kansas, I was a double PK. I was the son of a preacher and a professor, and now my sons are the same things. My home church was Plymouth Congregational Church, and we had something every Christmas called the Annual Christmas Project. And honestly, we didn't do much benevolence work the rest of the year, so we got real on fire for Jesus right around Christmas time. And we knew we had to show we cared. And we were inspired by Jesus, who is the reason for the season, and we wanted to put Christ back in Christmas and all that. And a bunch of us from the youth group, we set out to spread love and joy, but we never thought for 1 minute that the way we were doing it was condescending. We made these baskets for the poor, as we called them, and then we dared to go into what was called the ghetto in those days to distribute them. And we felt good about it. In fact, we were proud as peacocks. First, we collected money somehow. I don't remember how we got the money, maybe a car wash, a rummage sale, embezzled from our parents, I don't know. We got the money somehow. And then we called up the Department of Social Services. And we asked them matter-of-factly, who are the poor in this community? We need a list. So they would give us a list. And we'd take this list. Here are the needy families, we said. We're going to help them. We're going to bring Christmas to their little shack. And we brought some fruit and candy that we had bought, apples and oranges, and we put them all in a sack. And then we put the sack in a basket, and we tied a bow on the top, and we put a little card in there with a hallmark verse about the true meaning of Christmas, and we headed out. But we knew how important it was to be humble, because after all, the whole Christmas story is humble. The baby Jesus was humble. The manger was humble, you know. So this is how we did it. First, we'd go up on the porch of this really, really sad-looking place with our little basket, and we'd knock on the door. And when we heard the person who lived in that little shack coming, we'd yell, "Merry Christmas!" And then we'd run and jump in the car and drive on to the next house. And we didn't really want to make contact. We were just making a delivery. And it was my turn to make the delivery. And this neighborhood was just downright depressing. I mean, some of these places didn't look fit for human habitation because they weren't. But I thought, well, they could use some Christmas cheer, and so I walked up onto this one porch and I knocked on the door. Nothing. I tried again. Nobody. I guess nobody's home. Nobody's home. Just to be sure, I knocked one more time. Okay, that's it. Nobody's home. Enjoying the thought. My friends were growing impatient. They started honking the horn. Then suddenly, his face was at the door, staring at me through the screen. It was a black face, and I'd not seen it at first in the shadows of the evening. But all of a sudden, there he was. And he said, "Hi." And I said, "Oh, hi." He said, "What can I do for you?" I thought to myself, what do I do now? I'm just trying to leave a basket here. Now I'm in a conversation with a real-life poor person. Then another face appeared. This face belonged to a woman. And she said, "Hi." And I said, "Hi." And then she said, get this, "Won't you come in?" Come in? Well, this wasn't working out like I planned. Sure, I'll come in, why not? They introduced themselves. "I'm Benjamin Johnson," the man said. "This is my wife, Claire." I thought to myself, how odd. They have names. "And your name?" "Who, me? I'm Robin Meyers from Plymouth Church, part of the youth group." "Oh yes," said Mrs. Johnson. "That's the big church, beautiful church." Then a little boy appeared from another room, looked like he was maybe 9 or 10, and he smiled and said to me, "What's in the basket?" I'd forgotten I was even holding this basket. And I said, "Oh, here, Merry Christmas." And I handed him the basket. He took it from me, and get this, he started getting into the basket. He started unwrapping the paper. He started opening the gift right there instead of waiting until I left. He took out an apple as if he intended to eat it. I'm thinking to myself, this is not working out like I planned. And then he did something really weird. He got out a second apple, and get this, he handed it to me. He gave me some of my own fruit. I'm thinking to myself, stupid kid, doesn't know how charity works. He's given me back my own stuff. Well, what was I supposed to do? After all, I'm supposed to be humble, so I took it, I took a bite out of it, and I thought to myself, well, here I am, sitting in the home of real-life poor people with real names, eating out of my own sack. But I'll never forget what I learned that day. I learned something as powerful as anything I ever learned in my life. It shapes my theology, my politics, my family life, and my understanding of God. And it's very simple until you think about it. And then it's very radical. All of us, and I do mean all of us, eat out of the same basket. Not mine and yours, his and hers, ours and theirs. No more, what do you people want, but what do all of us want to be? Because however we like to hide it behind slogans of the self-made man or manifest destiny or survival of the fittest, the truth is we all eat out of the same basket. We all eat together. The world is not our project or our opportunity to take from the poor and give to the rich and then sanctify our guilt with a little charity at Christmas time. We're all in this together, 365 days a year. The world is not our project, our opportunity to do these things. We've got to stop thinking of ourselves as if some are entitled and others are not, and recover our true first premise, imago Dei. That's our real first premise. That is our inheritance. We're made in the image of God. Some theologians call it the primal memory, this belief that we're from God and to God, and life is but a parenthesis in which we're called to remember where we came from, where we're going, and to whom we belong. Because the real message of Genesis isn't that we're infected with badness, but that God made the plants and the trees and vegetation of every kind, and he said that's good. Then God made light, a greater light to rule the day, a lesser to rule the night, the sun and the moon, and God said that's good. And then God filled the sea with fish and the sky with birds and even great sea monsters in the deep, and God said it's good. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of every kind. And so, get this, God saw that it was good. And then, at the end of this process, which had to be rather tiring, God made something else, slowly, out of the primal ooze of nothingness. God made a creature who could write poetry, paint masterpieces, raised Lazarus from the dead with medicine as well as faith. After God made all other things, God made us in God's own image. And after he had made you and me, it's the only time that God says, not this is good, but this is very good. That's because we are very good. And if we put ourselves down, that's a sin, and not a very original one. When God made you and me and Benjamin and Claire Johnson and every other human being in the world, God said, this is the very best I can do. Or as the Ephesians letter puts it, you are God's masterpiece. So the next time someone says something to you about being human, have a little talk with them. If you've done something extraordinary, something good and decent, something grand and hopeful, I want you just to say, well, I'm human. You know, hey, great cake, Grandma. Well, child, I'm human. Nice catch, Mr. Third Baseman. Well, I'm human. See, sitting next to you in this sanctuary right now, at this moment, is the image of God. All you have to do is look around. And every time you live up to your inheritance instead of down to your sickness, you are recreated in the image of God. And the next time you think you can't do something, just remember, hey, you're human. When I consider the heavens, the work of God's fingers, the moon and the stars, I think, what are persons that you're conscious of them? Women and men and girls and boys just like us. And the answer comes back clear as the bells we heard this morning. This I have made in my own image, only slightly less than myself. Amen.
Amen.